It was a quiet night, and the streets were empty except for a single car cruising through the downtown area. Marcus Reynolds, a well-dressed black man in his early 40s, was driving home after a long day at work. His mind was occupied with thoughts of his next big meeting. As the city's chief of internal affairs, Marcus was responsible for ensuring fairness and justice within the police department, a job he took very seriously. As Marcus drove, the faint sound of sirens broke the silence. Glancing in his rearview mirror, he noticed flashing red and blue lights behind him. Confused, Marcus slowed his car and pulled over to the side of the road. He hadn't been speeding or breaking any traffic rules, so he wondered what the officer wanted. Before he could even turn off his engine, a police officer approached his car with a flashlight in one hand and his other hand hovering near his gun. The officer, whose badge read Officer T. Coulson, looked tense. Marcus rolled down his window and greeted him politely. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Marcus asked calmly. Coulson's eyes narrowed as he shined the flashlight directly into Marcus's face. His tone was sharp and commanding. "License and registration. Now." Marcus handed over the documents without hesitation, keeping his movements slow and deliberate to avoid alarming the officer. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" he inquired, maintaining his calm demeanor. Coulson ignored the question, inspecting the documents while muttering under his breath. Then he abruptly stepped back and placed his hand on his holstered gun. "Step out of the vehicle," Coulson ordered. Marcus was taken aback but remained composed. "Officer, can you tell me what this is about?" he asked again, his voice steady but firm. Coulson's voice rose slightly, and he repeated, "Step out of the car." Now, understanding the seriousness of the situation, Marcus slowly opened the door and stepped out. He stood tall, his hands visible at all times. Despite the tension, his expression remained calm. Coulson's gaze hardened as he scrutinized Marcus, his behavior becoming increasingly aggressive. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" he asked, his tone filled with suspicion. Marcus was stunned by the question. It was clear this wasn't about a traffic violation. Coulson had already made assumptions about him, and Marcus could feel the weight of those assumptions in the officer's tone. But instead of reacting with anger, Marcus responded confidently. "I live and work in this city, Officer Coulson," he said, carefully enunciating each word. "I'm heading home from my office." Before Coulson could respond, Marcus added firmly, "I believe you should know who I am." Coulson froze, his grip tightening on his holster. The air between them was thick with tension. Marcus met his gaze and calmly said, "I'm Marcus Reynolds, Chief of Internal Affairs. I oversee this department." Coulson's eyes widened in shock, his confidence suddenly wavering. Officer Coulson stood frozen, his hand still resting on the grip of his holstered gun. The words Marcus had just spoken hung in the air like a thunderclap. Chief of Internal Affairs. Those 5 words carried more weight than Coulson had expected. His confident, aggressive demeanor faltered, replaced by confusion and unease. Marcus, sensing the shift in Coulson's attitude, remained calm. He straightened his posture and locked eyes with the officer. "Now, Officer Coulson," Marcus said firmly but evenly, "I believe you owe me an explanation for why you stopped me and why you escalated this situation unnecessarily." Coulson stammered, his usual bravado crumbling under the weight of Marcus's presence. "Oh, well, I thought—" he began but quickly stopped himself. He glanced around, as if searching for an escape from the increasingly uncomfortable moment. "You looked suspicious, driving around here so late." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of disappointment and controlled anger. "Suspicious," he repeated, his tone steady. "Tell me, officer, what about me seems suspicious to you? My car, my suit, or perhaps something else?" Coulson's face turned red. He looked down, avoiding Marcus's piercing gaze. For the first time, he seemed to understand the gravity of his actions, but instead of apologizing, he tried to defend himself. "This neighborhood has had some issues recently," he muttered, "and we're supposed to keep an eye out for anything unusual." Marcus sighed, his patience thinning, but still intact. "Unusual, Officer Coulson, or just inconvenient for someone like you? Let me remind you, as Chief of Internal Affairs, it's my job to investigate cases exactly like this. Situations where officers act based on assumptions rather than facts." At that moment, another set of flashing lights appeared in the distance. A second patrol car pulled up, and two officers stepped out. They were older and more experienced than Coulson, their demeanor calm and professional. One of them, Sergeant Alvarez, immediately recognized Marcus. His eyes widened in surprise, and he approached with urgency. "Chief Reynolds, I didn't realize it was you, sir," Alvarez said, his tone respectful. "Is everything all right here?" Before Marcus could answer, Coulson stepped back, his earlier aggression now replaced by nervous silence. Alvarez glanced at Coulson, then back at Marcus, sensing the tension. "Sir, I apologize if there's been a misunderstanding," Alvarez said quickly, trying to diffuse the situation. Marcus nodded but didn't smile. "Sergeant, I appreciate your professionalism, but there's no misunderstanding here. Officer Coulson's actions tonight have been inappropriate, and I'll be addressing them directly with the department." Coulson's face went pale. "Sir, I didn't mean," he started to say, but Marcus raised a hand to stop him. "No, Officer Coulson," Marcus said, his voice firm. "You've already said enough. Now, I suggest you take this as a moment to reflect because I will be reporting this." Coulson stood silently, realizing his career might have just taken a turn for the worse. The second patrol car's arrival broke the tension in the air, but it also signaled a shift in how the situation would unfold. The two officers who stepped out of the vehicle, Sergeant Alvarez and Officer Jenkins, were experienced officers who knew the rules and respected their superiors. When they saw Marcus standing outside his car, they immediately understood the gravity of the moment. Their eyes met, and Sergeant Alvarez's face went from surprise to concerned. "Chief Reynolds," Alvarez said quickly, walking over with an expression of respect. "I didn't realize it was you, sir. Is everything okay?" Marcus nodded, keeping his composure. "I'm fine, Sergeant, but we have a problem here." He motioned to Officer Coulson, who was still standing awkwardly by the car. Coulson, now realizing the full extent of the situation, took a step back, trying to regain some of his lost confidence. The sight of Alvarez and Jenkins arriving wasn't lost on him. The two officers were professional, and they knew Marcus by reputation. They also understood the importance of keeping their interactions with internal affairs above board. Alvarez turned to Coulson, his voice even but firm. "Officer Coulson, what happened here? Why did you pull over Chief Reynolds?" Coulson hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under the direct questioning. He shifted his weight and mumbled something about suspicious behavior and late-night driving. But his explanation didn't make sense. It seemed like he was grasping at excuses. Marcus listened carefully but remained silent. He had heard enough. He didn't need to hear Coulson's excuse. He already knew it was baseless. What mattered now was how Coulson would handle the situation and whether the other officers would back up Marcus. Jenkins, the other officer who had stepped out of the second patrol car, was a quiet man but always professional. He glanced at Coulson and then at Marcus, sensing that something was off. "Sir, I apologize if this was a misunderstanding," Jenkins said to Marcus. "It wasn't our intention to cause any trouble." Marcus gave Jenkins a nod, appreciating his respectful tone. "Thank you, Officer Jenkins," he replied. "But I'm afraid this goes beyond a simple misunderstanding." Officer Coulson escalated the situation unnecessarily. "I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss when I file my report." Coulson's face flushed red again as he realized how badly he had handled the situation. He opened his mouth to speak but seemed to think better of it. His earlier cocky attitude had completely disappeared, replaced by a mix of guilt and fear. Marcus turned to Alvarez. "Sergeant, I need a report from you and Officer Jenkins. This interaction needs to be documented. I'll also be filing a formal complaint with the department about Coulson's actions tonight." Alvarez nodded, his expression serious. "Understood, Chief. We'll make sure everything is handled properly." As the officers began to take statements, Marcus remained calm but firm. He knew this incident wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about a larger issue within the police department, one that needed to be addressed. For now, though, all he could do was ensure this particular situation didn't go unchecked. Coulson stood silently, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. He knew his actions would soon be under a much closer spotlight. The silence after the backup officers arrived was thick with tension. As Sergeant Alvarez and Officer Jenkins worked to gather the facts, Marcus stood nearby, his arms crossed, his expression calm but resolute. He wasn't angry. No, that would have been too easy. Marcus knew better than to let his emotions take the lead. Instead, he focused on the facts. Officer Coulson had crossed a line, and Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. Coulson, on the other hand, was visibly nervous. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced with guilt and uncertainty. He kept his eyes on the ground, fidgeting with the strap of his gun holster. When he looked up, he seemed unsure whether to speak or remain silent. Marcus, not wanting to give Coulson a chance to deflect responsibility, turned to face him directly. "Officer Coulson," he began, his voice steady and firm, "I need to understand why you escalated this situation." His words were measured, careful, but each one carried a weight that made Coulson shift uneasily. I thought you were a suspect," Coulson stammered, his voice trailing off. "You were in a part of town where things have been happening lately. I didn't know." Marcus didn't flinch. "You didn't know. Officer Coulson, if you didn't know who I was, why didn't you check my identification before drawing your weapon?" His tone remained calm, but was laced with a quiet authority that made Coulson's knees feel weak. Coulson mumbled something about following protocol, but his explanation sounded weak and unconvincing. He had jumped to conclusions based on nothing but prejudice, and Marcus knew it. "I'm going to be honest with you, Officer Coulson," Marcus continued. "I've seen too many officers act out of fear or bias, and it's becoming a problem." His eyes locked onto Coulson's. "If you can't even recognize the Chief of Internal Affairs, how are you supposed to properly serve the people you're supposed to protect?" Coulson didn't have an answer. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Meanwhile, Sergeant Alvarez had finished gathering the basic details from the other officer, Officer Jenkins. They had begun filling out paperwork and preparing to document the entire interaction for their records. The situation had changed quickly from a simple traffic stop to a much larger issue. What had started as an ordinary night in the city had turned into an uncomfortable confrontation about the way some officers viewed the world. Marcus turned to Alvarez. "Sergeant, I'll be filing a formal report on this incident. I want every detail documented, and I expect this to be handled appropriately." His words were sharp but calm. "This isn't just about what happened tonight. This is about making sure something like this doesn't happen again." Alvarez nodded, looking serious. "Understood, Chief. We'll make sure it's all documented properly." As the paperwork was being completed, Marcus stood still, watching Coulson closely. He didn't need to say anything more. Coulson knew the consequences of his actions would be far-reaching. He had made a mistake, and it was one he would have to answer for. With the formalities wrapped up, Marcus finally spoke to Coulson one last time. "I hope you take this seriously, officer. If you can't uphold the law fairly, then you have no place wearing that badge." The next morning, Marcus Reynolds arrived at the Internal Affairs office earlier than usual. The events of the previous night had left him with a heavy feeling, but his focus was clear. He had a responsibility to his city, to its people, and most of all, to the idea of fairness and justice that his department stood for. The incident with Officer Coulson wasn't just a mistake. It was a wake-up call. As the Chief of Internal Affairs, Marcus's job was to investigate complaints and ensure that the police department upheld the law. But this wasn't just about one officer. This was about the pattern of behavior that led to the dangerous situation the night before. Marcus was determined to get to the bottom of it, and that meant going deeper than Coulson's actions alone. He sat down at his desk and immediately began reviewing Coulson's file. It wasn't long before Marcus found what he was looking for: a history of complaints, each one a red flag. There were several reports from citizens claiming that Coulson had acted aggressively, especially toward black men and women. Some complaints were vague. Others detailed specific instances of racial bias. Marcus felt a mix of frustration and anger as he scanned through the records. This wasn't the first time Coulson had acted out of line. It wasn't even the second. This was a pattern, one that had been ignored for far too long. Internal Affairs had received these complaints, but for reasons Marcus couldn't understand, nothing had been done. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was a message from Sergeant Alvarez. "The report's been filed. Coulson has been temporarily suspended while the investigation proceeds." Marcus read the message twice, making sure he understood it correctly. Suspended for now, but that wasn't enough. Coulson needed to be held accountable for his actions, and the department needed to address the systemic issues that allowed officers like Coulson to stay on the force. Marcus stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the city below. It was a beautiful city, but it had its problems. The police force was supposed to protect and serve, not make assumptions based on race. It was Marcus's job to make sure that ideal wasn't just a slogan. He couldn't let this go. He returned to his desk and started drafting the official report. His words were carefully chosen, each sentence a step in making sure Coulson's actions would be thoroughly investigated. Marcus wasn't just going to report the incident from last night. He was going to ensure that this wasn't something that could happen again. He would dig deeper into Coulson's past actions, review every complaint, and ensure that the department understood the seriousness of the situation. As the day went on, Marcus made calls to other department heads, ensuring they understood the gravity of the issue at hand. He also set up a meeting with the police commissioner, where he would present his findings and demand action. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy process, but he was prepared. The only way to change things was to face the uncomfortable truths and take bold action. Marcus closed the file on Coulson for the moment and took a deep breath. This was only the beginning, but he was ready to do what it took to make the department better, for everyone. Word of the incident quickly spread throughout the city. What had started as a small altercation on an empty street the previous night had turned into a topic of heated discussion. The news outlets covered the story, sharing details of the police officer's misconduct and Marcus's position as chief of internal affairs. The community was in an uproar, and the situation quickly escalated from a simple traffic stop to a larger debate about police accountability and racial bias within the department. Protesters gathered outside the police station, waving signs demanding justice. The crowd was peaceful, but their message was clear. They wanted change. No justice, no peace. They chanted, a common slogan heard in protests across the country. The anger was palpable, but so was the hope that things could finally change. Marcus watched the scenes unfold from his office. His phone rang constantly, and he could hear the growing noise outside the building. He wasn't surprised by the public reaction. He had known from the beginning that this situation wasn't just about Officer Coulson. It was about something much larger. It was about trust. It was about the broken relationship between the community and the police force. And it was about making sure that no one, officer or civilian, was above the law. He spent the morning reviewing the statements and interviews collected by his team, preparing for the meeting with the police commissioner. He needed to ensure that the findings were clear and that everyone understood the seriousness of the situation. But it wasn't just the facts that weighed heavily on Marcus's mind. It was the faces of the people outside, the ones whose trust in the system had been broken time and time again. He sat back in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him. For years, he had worked to maintain fairness in the police force. Now it felt like that work had all been for nothing. Officers like Coulson were allowed to continue their jobs despite a history of complaints. And now, a single encounter had opened up the floodgates of public dissatisfaction. Marcus knew he had to act quickly, but he also understood the delicate balance of the situation. He couldn't rush through this. It had to be handled carefully and fairly. He wasn't just dealing with one officer. He was dealing with a broken system. And the public's trust had to be rebuilt piece by piece. Outside, the protests continued, their energy growing stronger as the day wore on. Marcus knew the eyes of the city, and perhaps the entire country, were on him. He had to show that internal affairs wasn't just a department that investigated complaints. It was a force for change. It was time to hold everyone accountable, from the officers who violated their duty to the higher-ups who allowed it to happen. As the hours passed, Marcus prepared himself for the meeting with the police commissioner. He knew it would be difficult. The commissioner, like many others in the department, had a vested interest in protecting the reputation of the police force. But Marcus was determined. He had seen the damage that officers like Coulson could do, and he wouldn't allow it to continue. The department needed to change, and Marcus was prepared to do whatever it took to make sure that change happened. The city was watching. And so was Marcus. The investigation into Officer Coulson had only just begun, but already Marcus could tell it was going to be more complicated than he had expected. The more he dug into Coulson's history, the clearer it became that the officer's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just a bad night on the job. It was part of a pattern. Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing the records in front of him. Coulson had been with the department for over a decade, but his history was filled with red flags. There were several complaints lodged against him over the years, but many had been quietly dismissed or ignored. The more Marcus read, the more troubled he became. One particular case stood out. A civilian had filed a complaint claiming that Coulson had unfairly targeted him during a traffic stop, accusing him of being suspicious because he was black. The report detailed how Coulson had raised his voice and ordered the man out of his car without cause. The incident ended with Coulson issuing a ticket for a minor violation, but the man had been left feeling humiliated and scared. Marcus couldn't believe that the department had allowed Coulson's behavior to continue unchecked. This wasn't just one mistake. It was a long-standing issue that no one had bothered to address. Marcus felt a deep sense of responsibility as he read through each case. He knew that exposing Coulson's history wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. This kind of behavior had to be stopped, and if it meant uncovering uncomfortable truths about the department's failure to act, then so be it. He picked up the phone and dialed Sergeant Alvarez's number. It rang twice before Alvarez picked up. "Alvarez, I need everything you can find on Coulson's previous complaints. I'm going to need a full report on each one," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Understood, Chief. I'll have the files ready for you by this afternoon," Alvarez replied. After the call, Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just Coulson. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there had been a failure at every level. The complaints against Coulson had been brushed aside, overlooked by those who should have held him accountable. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. This was about a larger problem within the department, an issue of accountability, transparency, and trust. Marcus knew that if he wanted to truly fix things, he would have to expose everything. Every mistake, every cover-up, every failure. By the time Alvarez arrived with the files, Marcus had already started drafting his report. The weight of the task before him was enormous, but Marcus was resolute. He had seen too many officers get away with misconduct. This time, it would be different. Alvarez placed the files on Marcus's desk. "Here's everything we've got on Coulson," he said, his tone somber. Marcus nodded and opened the first file. As he read through the documents, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It was clear that Coulson's actions were not just the result of a single bad decision. This was a long-standing issue, and Marcus was determined to make sure it was addressed once and for all. The day of the public hearing had arrived, and Marcus Reynolds knew it was going to be one of the toughest days of his career. The tension in the air was palpable, and the pressure was on. The entire city was watching, waiting to see what would happen next after the events that had unfolded the night of the traffic stop. The police department was under a microscope, and Marcus's every decision would be scrutinized. Inside the hearing room, the atmosphere was serious. Several members of the city council sat at the front, ready to hear the findings of the investigation. At the table, Marcus sat calmly, prepared to present the facts. Coulson had been called in, his face a mixture of defiance and nervousness. He knew this was his moment to explain himself, or at least try to. Marcus cleared his throat and began speaking. "Thank you for gathering here today. What we are about to discuss goes beyond just one officer's behavior. It is about addressing a culture that has allowed racial bias and misconduct to go unchecked for far too long within our police department." The room fell silent as Marcus continued. "Last week, Officer Coulson pointed a gun at a citizen who posed no threat, simply because of an assumption based on race. This, unfortunately, is not an isolated incident. As part of the investigation, I reviewed several previous complaints against Coulson, and the results are clear. He has a history of discriminatory behavior, and his actions were part of a larger problem." Marcus paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. He wasn't just speaking to the council members in front of him. He was speaking to the city. His voice was steady, but each word carried the power of the truth. "As Chief of Internal Affairs, it is my responsibility to uphold the law and ensure that all officers are held accountable," Marcus continued. "This is not just about one officer. It is about ensuring that we create a police force that truly serves and protects all people, no matter their race or background." Coulson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly realizing that his previous attempts to justify his actions were no longer enough. He had nowhere to hide. The evidence was in front of everyone, and there was no escaping it. Marcus looked directly at the council members. "I am recommending that Officer Coulson be permanently removed from the force, and that a full review of our department's procedures be conducted. We need to ensure that no officer is above the law, and we need to ensure that every member of the department is held to the highest standards of professionalism and respect." The room buzzed with whispers as the council members exchanged glances. Some looked concerned, while others seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Marcus knew that change would not come easily, but it had to start somewhere. One of the council members, a woman with a serious expression, stood up. "I think Chief Reynolds has made an important point," she said. "We cannot allow this behavior to continue. We need to take action, and we need to do it now." The room went quiet once again as the council discussed the matter. Marcus stood silently, knowing the decision was out of his hands now. He had done what he could, but the final judgment would come from those in power. After what felt like an eternity, the council made their decision. Coulson was officially terminated from the force, and a new plan for reforming the department was set in motion. It was a victory, but Marcus knew this was just the beginning. True change would take time, and it would take effort from everyone involved. As the meeting concluded, Marcus left the room with a sense of relief, but also with a deep understanding of the work that still lay ahead. The fight for justice and equality was ongoing, but today was a step in the right direction. The decision had been made, and Marcus felt a wave of both relief and responsibility wash over him. Officer Coulson was officially fired, and the police department had begun its process of reform. But Marcus knew that while one battle had been won, there was still a long road ahead to rebuild the trust that had been broken, not just with the community, but within the department itself. The news of Coulson's termination spread quickly throughout the city. The protests that had taken place just days before turned into peaceful celebrations. People felt like their voices had been heard, and for the first time in a long while, they believed that real change could happen. Marcus saw it in the faces of the citizens, in the conversations he overheard as he walked through the streets. There was a sense of hope, a belief that the city could move forward together. But Marcus wasn't fooled. He knew that change didn't happen overnight. The decision to fire Coulson was just one part of a much larger effort. The police department needed to address the culture of bias that had allowed officers like Coulson to slip through the cracks for so long. They needed to create a culture of transparency, accountability, and fairness, something that was built on trust rather than fear. Over the next few weeks, Marcus worked tirelessly with the city council and other department heads to implement reforms. They began by establishing new training programs to help officers recognize and address their own biases. There were also discussions about improving the process for reporting complaints and making sure that those complaints were thoroughly investigated. Marcus was determined that this wouldn't be another round of empty promises. This time, things would be